Okay, The Birth of the Clinic by Michel Foucault, Chapter 6, Signs and Cases. And here we have the unbounded extent of the clinical domain. Unravel the principle and cause of an illness through the confusion and obscurity of the symptoms. Know its nature, its forms, its complications. Distinguish at first glance all its characteristics and differences. By means of a prompt and delicate analysis, separate it from all that is foreign to it. Foresee what beneficial or detrimental events might occur in the course of its duration. Use the favorable moments that nature provides to effect a solution. Calculate the forces of life and the activity of the organs. Augment or diminish their energy as required. Determine precisely when you should act and when it would be better to wait. Decide confidently between several methods of treatment, all of which offer advantages and inconveniences. Choose the one whose effects seem most rapid, most agreeable, and most certain of success. Benefit from experience. Seize your opportunities. Calculate your chances and your risks. Make yourself master of your patients and their affections. Assuage their pains. Calm their anxieties. Anticipate their needs. Bear with their whims. Make the most of their characters and command their will, not as a cruel tyrant reigns over his slaves, but as a kind father who watches over the destiny of his children. This solemn prolix text yields its meaning in the light of another statement, which paradoxically, through its sheer brevity, can be superimposed. One must, as far as possible, make science ocular. So many powers from the slow illumination of obscurities, the ever-prudent reading of the essential, the calculation of times and risks, to the mastery of the heart and the majestic confiscation of paternal authority, are just so many forms in which the sovereignty of the gaze gradually establishes itself. The eye that knows and decides, the eye that governs. The clinic was probably the first attempt to order science on the exercise and decisions of the gaze. From the second half of the 17th century, natural history had set out to analyze and classify natural beings according to their visible characters. All this treasure of knowledge that antiquity and the Middle Ages had accumulated, and which concerned the virtues of plants, the powers of animals, secret correspondences and sympathies. Since Ray, all this had become marginal knowledge for naturalists. What remained to be discovered, however, were structures, that is, forms spatial arrangements, the number and size of elements. Natural history took upon itself the task of mapping them, of transcribing them in discourse, of preserving, confronting, and combining them, in order to make it possible, on the one hand, to determine the vicinities and kinships of living beings, and therefore the unity of creation, and, on the other, to recognize rapidly any individual and therefore his unique place in creation. The clinic demands as much of the gaze as natural history, as much and to a certain extent the same thing. To see, to isolate features, to recognize those that are identical and those that are different, to regroup them, to classify them by species or families. The naturalist model to which medicine had partly been subjected in the 18th century remained active. The old dream of Boissier de Sauvage of being the Linnaeus of diseases was not entirely forgotten in the 19th century. Doctors long continued to botanize in the field of the pathological, but the medical gaze was also organized in a new way. First, it was no longer the gaze of any observer, but that of a doctor supported and justified by an institution, that of a doctor endowed with the power of decision and intervention. Moreover, it was a gaze that was not bound by the narrow grid of structure, form, arrangement, number, size, but that could and should grasp colors, variations, tiny anomalies, always receptive to the deviant. Finally, it was a gaze that was not content to observe what was self-evident. It must make it possible to outline chances and risks. It was calculating. It would be untrue, no doubt, to see in late 18th century clinical medicine a mere return to the purity of a gaze long burdened with false knowledge. It is not even a question of a displacement of this gaze or of a finer application of its extent. New objects were to present themselves to the medical gaze in the sense that, and at the same time as, the knowing subject reorganizes himself, changes himself, and begins to function in a new way. It was not, therefore, the conception of disease that changed first and later the way in which it was recognized, nor was it the signalétic system that was changed first and then the theory, but together and at a deeper level, the relation between the disease and this gaze to which it offers itself, in which at the same time it constitutes. At this level, there was no distinction to be made between theory and experience. methods and results, one had to read the deep structures of visibility in which field and gaze are bound together by codes of knowledge. In this chapter, we shall study these two codes in their two major forms: the linguistic structure of the sign and the aleatory structure of the case. In the medical tradition of the 18th century, the disease was observed in terms of symptoms and signs. These were distinguished from one another as much by their semantic value as by their morphology. The symptom, hence its uniquely privileged position, is the form in which the disease is presented. Of all that is visible, it is closest to the essential. It is the first transcription of the inaccessible nature of the disease. Cough, fever, pain in the side, and difficulty in breathing are not pleurisy itself. The disease itself is never exposed to the senses, but reveals itself only to reasoning. But they form its essential symptom, since they make it possible to designate a pathological state, in contradistinction to health. A morbid essence, different, for example, from pneumonia, and an immediate cause, a discharge of serosity. The symptoms allow the invariable form of the disease, set back somewhat, visible and invisible, to show through. The sign announces the prognostic sign, what will happen; the anamnestic sign, what has happened; the diagnostic sign, what is now taking place. Between it and the disease is a distance that it cannot cross without accentuating it, for it often appears obliquely and unexpectedly. It does not offer anything to knowledge. At most, it provides a basis for recognition, a recognition that gradually gropes its way into the dimensions of the hidden. The pulse betrays the invisible strength and rhythm of the circulation. Or, again, the sign discloses time. Just as the bluing of the nails is an unfailing announcement of death, or the crisis of the fourth day. In intestinal fevers promise recovery. Through the invisible, the sign indicates that which is further away, below, later. It concerns the outcome, life and death, time, not that immobile truth, that given, hidden truth that the symptoms restore to their transparency as phenomena. Thus, the 18th century transcribed the double reality, natural and dramatic, of disease. establishing the truth of a corpus of knowledge and the possibility of its application. A happy, calm structure in which a balance was struck between the nature-death system with visible forms taking root in the invisible and the time outcome system, which anticipated the invisible by means of a visible mapping out, repérage. Both these systems existed for themselves. Their difference is a fact of nature to which medical perception adapted itself, but which it did not constitute. The formation of the clinical method was bound up with the emergence of the doctor's gaze into the field of signs and symptoms. The recognition of its constituent rights involved the effacement of their absolute distinction and the postulate that henceforth the signifier, sign, and symptom would be entirely transparent for the signified, which would appear without concealment or residue. The heart of the disease would be entirely exhausted in the intelligible syntax of the signifier. Roman numeral 1. The symptoms constitute a primary stratum indissociably signifier and signified. There is no longer a pathological essence beyond the symptoms. Everything in the disease is itself a phenomenon. In that respect, the symptoms play a simple role, primary in nature. Their collection forms what is known as the disease. They are nothing more than a truth wholly given to the gaze. Their link and status do not refer to an essence, but indicate a natural totality that has only its principles of composition and its more or less regular forms of duration. A disease is whole because one can assign it its elements. It has an aim because one can calculate its results. It is therefore a whole placed between the limits of invasion and termination. The symptom has therefore lost its role of sovereign indicator. Being merely a phenomenon of the law of appearance, it is on the same level as nature. Yet not entirely so. Something in the immediacy of the symptom signifies the pathological, which distinguishes it from a phenomenon belonging purely and simply to organic life. By phenomenon, I mean any notable change in the healthy or sick body. Hence the division into those that belong to health and those that designate disease. The latter are easily confused with the symptoms or sensible appearance of the disease. By this simple opposition to the forms of health, the symptom abandons its passivity as a natural phenomenon and becomes a signifier of the disease, that is, of itself taken as a whole, since the disease is simply a collection of symptoms. There is a strange ambiguity here, since in its signifying function, the symptom refers to both the relation between phenomena themselves, to what constitutes their totality and the form of their coexistence, and to the absolute difference that separates health from disease. It signifies, therefore, by tautology, the totality of what it is, and by its emergence, the exclusion of what it is not. In its existence as pure phenomenon, it is indissociably the only nature of the disease, and the disease constitutes its only nature as a specific phenomenon. When it acts as a signifier in relation to itself, it is therefore doubly signified by itself and by the disease, which, by characterizing it, opposes it to non-pathological phenomena. But when taken as a signified by itself or by the disease, it can receive its meaning only from an earlier act that does not belong to its sphere, from an act that totalizes and isolates it, that is, from an act that has transformed it into a sign in advance. This complexity in the structure of the symptom is to be found in all philosophy of the natural sign. Clinical thought merely transposes into the more laconic and more often confused vocabulary of practice a conceptual configuration whose discursive form was available in all latitude to Condillac. In the general equilibrium of clinical thought, the symptom plays more or less the role of the language of action. Like it, it is caught up in the general movement of nature, and its force of manifestation is a primitive, as naturally given as the instinct that bears this initial form of language. It is the disease in its manifest state, just as the language of action is the impression itself in the animation that prolongs it, maintains it, and turns it back into an external form, which is of the same nature as its internal truth. But it is conceptually impossible that this immediate language should take on meaning for another's gaze without the intervention of an act originating in another place. an act of which Condillac himself availed himself in advance by conferring consciousness upon the two speechless subjects, sujets sans parole, imagined in their immediate motility, and whose singular sovereign nature he has hidden by inserting it into the communicative, simultaneous movements of instinct. When he posits the language of action as the origin of speech, Condillac slips secretly into it by depriving it of any concrete figure, syntax, words, and even sounds. The linguistic structure inherent in each of the acts of a speaking subject. This enabled him to extract from the language of action language as such, since he had already inserted the possibility of language into the language of action. The same thing applies in the clinic, where the relations between this language of action, which is the symptom, and the explicitly linguistic structure of the sign are concerned. Roman numeral 2. It is the sovereignty of consciousness that transforms the symptom into a sign. Signs and symptoms are and say the same thing. The only difference being that the sign says the same thing that is precisely the symptom. In its material reality, the sign is identified with the symptom itself. The symptom is the indispensable morphological support of the sign. Hence, no sign without a symptom. But what makes the sign a sign belongs not to the symptom, but to an activity that originates elsewhere. Thus, every symptom is a sign by right, but not every sign is a symptom. In the sense that the totality of symptoms will never be able to exhaust the reality of the sign. How does this operation occur, which transforms the symptom into a signifying element, and which signifies the disease as precisely as the immediate truth of the symptom? By an operation that makes visible to itself the totality of the field of experience at each of its stages, and dissipates all its opaque structures. An operation that totalizes by comparing organisms, tumor, redness, heat, pain, throbbing, tension as a sign of phlegmon, because one hand is compared with another, one individual with another. An operation that recalls normal functioning. Cold breath is in one subject is a sign of the disappearance of animal heat, and therefore of a radical weakening of the vital forces and of their imminent destruction. An operation that registers the frequency of simultaneity or succession. What relation is there between a coated tongue, a trembling of the lower lip, and a tendency to vomit? We do not know, but observation has shown the first two phenomena accompanied by that state, and that is enough for them to become signs in future. Lastly, an operation which, beyond first appearances, scrutinizes the body and discovers at the autopsy a visible. Thus, the examination of corpses has shown that in cases of pleuropneumonia with expectoration, the sudden interruption of pain and the gradual weakening of the pulse beat are signs of a hepatization of the lung. Beneath a gaze that is sensitive to difference, simultaneity or succession, and frequency, the symptom therefore becomes a sign, a spontaneously differential operation, devoted to totality and to memory, and calculating as well, an act, therefore, that joins in a single movement the element and the connection of the elements among themselves. In that sense, it is really no more than Condiac's analysis put into practice in medical perception. Here and there is it not simply a question of composing and decomposing our ideas in order to make different comparisons with them, and in order to discover by this means the relation that they have among themselves and the new ideas that they may produce. Analysis and the clinical gaze also have this feature in common, that they compose and decompose only in order to reveal an ordering that is the natural order itself. Their artifice is to operate only in the restitutive act of the original. This analysis is the true secret of discoveries, because it makes us go back to the origin of things. For the clinic, this origin is the natural order of symptoms, the form of their succession or their reciprocal determination. Between sign and symptom, there is a decisive difference that assumes value only against the background of an essential identity. The sign is the symptom itself, but in its original truth. At last, there emerges on the horizon of clinical experience the possibility of an exhaustive, clear, and complete reading. For a doctor whose skills would be carried to the highest degree of perfection, all symptoms would become signs. All pathological manifestations would speak a clear, ordered language. One would at last be on a level with that serene, accomplished form of scientific knowledge, that well-made language, langue bien faite, of which Condillac speaks. Roman numeral 3. The being of the disease can be entirely stated in its truth. External signs taken from the pulse, heat, breathing, hearing, alteration in facial features, nervous or spasmodic affections, and impairment of the natural appetites formed by their various combinations, separate, more or less distinct, or strongly pronounced pictures. A disease must be regarded as an indivisible whole from its beginning to its end, a regular set of characteristic symptoms and a succession of periods. It is no longer a question of giving that by which the disease can be recognized, but of restoring at the level of words a history that covers its total being. To the exhaustive presence of the disease in its symptoms corresponds the unobstructed transparency of the pathological being with the syntax of a descriptive language. A fundamental isomorphism of the structure of the disease and of the verbal form that circumscribes it. The descriptive act is, by right, a seizure of being, une prise d'être, and inversely, being does not appear in symptomatic and therefore essential manifestations without offering itself to the mastery of a language that is the very speech of things. In the medicine of species, the nature of a disease and its description could not correspond without an intermediate stage that formed the picture with its two dimensions in clinical medicine, to be seen and to be spoken immediately, communicate in the manifest truth of the disease of which it is precisely the whole being. There is disease only in the element of the visible and therefore statable. The clinic brings into play what, for Condillac, was the fundamental relation between the perceptual act and the element of language. The clinician's description, like the philosopher's analysis, proffers what is given by the natural relation between the operation of consciousness and the sign. And in this repetition, the order of natural connections, enchaînement, is stated. Far from perverting the logical necessities of time, the syntax of language restores them in their most original articulation. To analyze is simply to observe in a successive order the qualities of an object with a view to ascribing to them the simultaneous order in which they exist. But what is this order? Nature herself indicates it. It is that in which it offers the object. The order of truth does only one thing with that of language, because both restore time to its necessary and statable, that is, discursive form. The history of diseases, to which Sauvage gave an obscurely spatial meaning, now assumes its chronological dimension. The course of time occupies, in the structure of this new knowledge, the role in classificatory medicine of the flat space of the nosological picture. the opposition between nature and time, between what is manifested and what announces, has disappeared. The distinction between the essence of the disease, its symptoms and its signs, has also disappeared. And the play and distance by which the disease was manifested, but at a distance, as it were, by which it betrayed itself, but at a distance and in uncertainty, have also disappeared. The disease escaped from this rotating structure of the visible that rendered it invisible, and the invisible that rendered it visible, and dissipated itself in the visible multiplicity of symptoms that signified its meaning without remainder. The medical field was no longer to know these silent species, whether given or withdrawn. It was to open onto something which always speaks a language that is at one in its existence and its meaning with the gaze that deciphers it. A language inseparably read and reading. As an isomorph of ideology, clinical experience offers it an immediate domain of application. Not that medicine, as Condillac supposed, had returned to an empirical respect for the thing perceived, but in the clinic, as in analysis, the armature of the real is designed on the model of language. The clinician's gaze and the philosopher's reflection have similar powers, because they both presuppose a structure of identical objectivity, in which the totality of being is exhausted in manifestations that are its signifiers signified, in which the visible and the manifest come together in at least a virtual identity, in which the perceived and the perceptible may be wholly restored in a language whose rigorous form declares its origin. The doctor's discursive, reflexive perception and the philosopher's discursive reflection on perception come together in a figure of exact superposition, since the world is for them the analog of language. Medicine as an uncertain kind of knowledge is an old theme to which the 18th century was especially sensitive. It was to be found, reinforced by recent history, in the traditional opposition between the art of medicine and the knowledge of inert things. The science of man is concerned with too complicated an object. It embraces a multitude of too varied facts. It operates on too subtle and too numerous elements, always to give to the immense combinations of which it is capable the uniformity, evidence, and certainty that characterize the physical sciences and mathematics. An uncertainty that was a sign of complexity concerning the object and of imperfection concerning science. No objective foundation was given to the conjectural character of medical outside the relation between that extreme scantiness and that excessive richness. Out of this defect, the 18th century, out of this defect, the 18th century, in its last years, made a positive element of knowledge. In the period of Laplace, either under his influence or within a similar movement of thought, medicine discovered that uncertainty may be treated analytically as the sum of a certain number of isolatable degrees of certainty that were capable of rigorous calculation. Thus, this confused negative concept, whose meaning derived from a traditional opposition to mathematical knowledge, was to be capable of transforming itself into a positive concept and offered to the penetration of a technique proper to calculation. This conceptual transformation was decisive. It opened up to investigation a domain in which each fact, observed, isolated, then compared with a set of facts, could take its place in a whole series of events whose convergence or divergence were in principle measurable. It saw each perceived element as a recorded event and the uncertain evolution in which it found itself an aleatory series. It gave to the clinical field a new structure in which the individual in question was not so much a sick person as the endlessly irreducible pathological fact to be found in all patients suffering in a similar way, in which the plurality of observations was no longer simply a contradiction or confirmation, but a progressive, theoretically endless convergence, in which time was not an unforeseen element that might conceal, in which must be dominated by anticipatory knowledge, but a dimension to be integrated, since it introduces the elements of the series into its own course as so many degrees of certainty. Through the introduction of probabilistic thought, medicine entirely renewed the perceptual values of its domain. The space in which the doctor's attention had to operate became an unlimited space, made up of isolatable events whose form of solidarity was of the order of the series. The simple dialectic of the pathological species and the sick individual, an enclosed space and an uncertain time, was, in principle, dislocated. Medicine no longer tried to see the essential truth beneath the sensible individuality. It was faced by the task of perceiving, and to infinity, the events of an open domain. This was the clinic. But at this period, this schema was neither radicalized, thought out, nor even drawn up in an absolutely coherent way. It was not so much an overall structure as a set of structural themes, juxtaposed with one another without having found their basis. Whereas in the case of the preceding configuration, sign language, the coherence was real, though often only half visible. Here, probability was being constantly invoked as a form of explanation or justification, but it only achieved a low degree of coherence. The reason for this did not lie in the mathematical theory of probabilities, but in the conditions that make it applicable. The enumeration of physiological or pathological facts, like that of a population, or a series of astronomical events, was not technically possible at a time when the hospital field was still so much on the fringe of medical experience that it often seemed to act as its caricature or distorting mirror. A conceptual mastery of probability in medicine implied the validation of a hospital domain which, in turn, could be recognized as a space of experience only by already probabilistic thinking. Hence, the imperfect, precarious, and partial character of the calculation of certainties, and the fact that it sought for itself a confused basis that was opposed to its intrinsic technological meaning. Thus, Cabanis tried to justify the instruments of the clinic, which were still in the process of being formed. with the aid of a concept whose technical and theoretical level belonged to a much earlier accretion. He put aside the old concept of uncertainty only in order to reactivate the hardly better adapted one of the imprecise, free profusion of nature. This profusion brings nothing in exact precision. It seems to have wished to preserve a certain latitude for itself in order to leave open the movements that it imprints, that the regular liberty that never allows them to depart from order, but which renders them more varied and gives them more grace. But the important, conclusive part of the text is to be found in the note accompanying it. This latitude corresponds exactly to that which the art may possess in practice, or rather, it provides it with its measure. The imprecision that Cabanis attributes to the movements of nature is merely a void to be occupied by the technical armature of a perception of cases. The principal stages in this process are as follows. Number 1, complexity of combination. The nosography of the 18th century implied a configuration of experience such that, however confused and complicated phenomena in their concrete presentation may be, they were related, more or less, to essences whose increasing generality guaranteed a decreasing complexity. The class was simpler than the species, which in turn was simpler than the actual immediate disease, with all its phenomena and its modifications in a given individual. At the end of the 18th century, and in a demarcation of experience similar to Condillac's, simplicity is not to be found in the essential generality, but at the primary level of the given, in the small number of endlessly repeated elements. It is not the class of fevers which, owing to the inadequate understanding of its concept, is the principle of intelligibility, but the small number of elements that are vital in a fever in every concrete case. The combinative variety of the simple forms constitutes empirical diversity. With each new case, one might think that we are presented with new facts, but they are merely different combinations, different subtleties. In the pathological state, there is never more than a small number of principal facts. All the others result from their combination and from their different degrees of intensity. The order in which they appear, their importance, their various relationships are given enough to give birth to every variety of disease. Consequently, the complexity of individual cases could no longer be attributed to those uncontrollable modifications that disturb essential truths and force us to decipher them only in an act of recognition that neglects and abstracts. It may be grasped and recognized in itself, in a complete fidelity to everything it presents, if one analyzes it according to the principles of a combination. That is, if one defines all the elements that compose it and the form of that composition. To know will therefore restore the movement by which nature associates. And it is in this sense that knowledge of life and life itself obey the same laws of Genesis. Whereas, in classificatory thinking, this coincidence could exist only once, and in divine understanding, the progress of knowledge now had the same origin and found itself caught up in the same empirical process of becoming, devenir. As the progression of life, nature wanted the source of our knowledge to be the same as that of life. We must receive impressions in order to live. We must receive impressions in order to know. And in each case, the law of development is the law of combination of these elements. Number 2, the principle of analogy. The combinative study of elements revealed analogous forms of coexistence or succession that made it possible to identify symptoms and diseases. The medicine of species and classes also made use of them in the decipherment of pathological phenomena. The resemblance of disorders could be recognized from one case to another, just as the appearance of their reproductive organs could be recognized from one plant to another. But these analogies related only to inert morphological data. It was a question of perceived forms whose general lines could be superimposed. An inactive, constant state of bodies, a state foreign to the present nature of the function. The analogies on which the clinical gaze rested in order to recognize in different patients signs and symptoms are of a different order. They consist in the relations that exist first between the constituent parts of a single disease and between a known disease and a disease to be known. Thus understood, analogy is no longer a more or less close kinship, then vanishes as one moves away from the essential identity. It is an isomorphism of relations between elements. It concerns a system of relations and reciprocal actions, a functioning or a dysfunctioning. Thus, difficulty in breathing is a phenomenon that is found in much the same morphology in phthisis, asthma, heart disease, pleurisy, and scurvy. But it would be misleading and dangerous to attach too much importance to such a resemblance. The fruitful analogy that identifies a symptom is in relation to other functions or other disorders. Muscular weakness, which is found in dropsy, a livid complexion, similar to that found in obstructions, spots on the skin, as in smallpox, and swollen gums, as that caused by an accumulation of tartar. Form, a constellation in which the coexistence of elements designates a functional interaction peculiar to scurvy. It is the analogy of these relations that makes it possible to identify a disease in a series of diseases. Furthermore, within the same disease and in the same patient, the principle of analogy may make it possible to define the singularity of the disease as a whole. Relying on the concept of sympathy, 18th century doctors had used and abused the notion of complication, which always enabled them to find a pathological essence by simply extracting from the manifest symptoms whatever elements contradicted the essential truth. And these elements were then labeled as interferences. Thus, gastric fever, headaches, thirst, pain in the pit of the stomach, still conformed with its essence when accompanied by prostration, involuntary evacuations, a low and intermittent pulse rate, difficulty in swallowing. It was then described as being complicated by an adynamic fever. A rigorous use of analogy was to make it possible to avoid such arbitrariness in distinctions and groupings. From one symptom to another in the same pathological entity, a certain analogy could be found in their relations with the external or internal causes that produced them. Thus, many nosographers saw bilious pleuropneumonia as a complicated disease. If one saw the homology of relations existing between gastricity, involving digestive symptoms and pains in the pit of the stomach, and irritation of the pulmonary organs, which suggests inflammation and respiratory disorders, different symptomatological sectors, apparently deriving from distinct morbid essences, make it possible nonetheless to give the disease its identity, that of a complex figure in the coherence of a unity, and not that of a mixed reality made up of mixed essences. Number 3, perception of frequencies. Medical knowledge will gain in certainty only in relation to the number of cases examined. This certainty will be complete if one extracts it from a mass of sufficient probability. But if there is no rigorous deduction of a sufficient number of cases, knowledge will remain of the order of conjecture and probability. It is no more than the simple expression of particular observations. Medical certainty is based not on the completely observed individuality, but on the completely scanned multiplicity of individual facts. By its multiplicity, the series becomes the vehicle of an index of convergence. Sauvage placed hemoptysis, the spitting of blood, among the hemorrhages and phthisis among the fevers, a distinction in accord with the structure of the phenomena that no symptomatic conjecture could challenge. But if the phthisis hemoptysis complex, despite many distinctions according to individual cases, circumstances, stages, achieves a certain qualitative density in the total series, their connection will become, over and above any encounter or any gap, outside even the manifest appearance of the phenomena, an essential relation. It is by studying the most frequent phenomena and meditating upon the order of their relations and their regular succession that one finds the basis of the general laws of nature. Individual variations are spontaneously effaced by integration. In the medicine of species, this effacement of particular modifications was assured only by a positive operation. In order to accede to the purity of essence, it was first necessary to possess it, and then to use it to obliterate the excessively rich content of experience. It was necessary, by a prior choice, to distinguish what is constant from what is variable in it, the essential from the purely accidental. In clinical experience, variations are not set aside. They separate of their own accord. They cancel each other out in the general configuration, because they are integrated into the domain of probability. They never fall outside the boundaries, however unexpected or extraordinary they may be. The abnormal is still a form of regularity. The study of monsters or of the monstrosities of the human species give us an idea of nature's teeming resources and of the gaps to which she can lend herself. So we must abandon the idea of an ideal, transcendent spectator, whose genius and patience might be approached to a greater or lesser degree by real observers. The only normative observer is the totality of observers. The errors produced by their individual points of view are distributed in a totality that possesses its own powers of indication. Their very divergences reveal, in this nucleus in which, after all, they intersect, the outline of undeniable identities. Several observers never see the same fact in an identical way, unless nature has really presented it to them in the same way. Notions circulate in obscurity and in an approximate vocabulary in which one can recognize the calculation of error, the gap, the boundaries, the value of the average. All these notions indicate that the visibility of the medical field assumes a statistical structure, and that medicine takes as its perceptual field not a garden of species, but a domain of events. But nothing has become formalized as yet, and curiously enough, it is in the effort to conceive a calculation of medical probabilities that failure and the reasons for the failure were to emerge. In principle, this failure was due not to ignorance or to a superficial use of mathematical tools, but to the organization of the field. Number 4, the calculation of the degrees of certainty. If one day one discovers in the calculation of probability a method that might be suitably adapted to complicated objects, to abstract ideas, to variable elements in medicine and physiology, one would soon produce the highest degree of certainty to which the sciences can attain. It is a question of a calculus which, from the outset, is valid within the domain of ideas, being both the principle of their analysis into constituent elements and a method of induction from frequencies. It is offered in an ambiguous way as a logical and arithmetical distortion of approximation. The problem is, in fact, that late 18th century medicine never knew whether it was concerned with a series of facts whose laws of appearance and convergence were to be determined simply by the study of repetitions, or whether it was concerned with a set of signs, symptoms, and manifestations whose coherence was to be sought in a natural structure. It never ceased to hesitate between a pathology of phenomena and a pathology of cases. That is why the calculation of degrees of probability was immediately confused with the analysis of symptomatic elements. In a very strange way, it was the sign as an element in a constellation that was attributed as a sort of natural right with a coefficient of probability. But what had given it its value as a sign was not an arithmetic of cases, but its connection with a set of phenomena. Under the appearances of mathematics, the stability of a figure was gauged. The term degree of certainty to be found in the writings of mathematicians designated, by a kind of crude mathematics, the more or less necessary character of an implication. A simple example will enable us to grasp the nature of this fundamental confusion. Brulé recalls the principle formulated by Jacques Bernoulli in his Ars Conjectandi, that all certainty may be regarded as a whole divisible into as many probabilities as one wishes. Thus, the certainty of pregnancy in a woman may be divided into 8 degrees. The disappearance of menstruation, nausea and vomiting in the first month, an increase in the size of the womb in the second month, a much greater increase of the womb in the third month, the extension of the womb over the pubic bones, the projection of the whole hypogastric region in the 5th month, and the spontaneous movement of the fetus, which kicks against the internal surface of the womb. Lastly, at the beginning of the last month, the movements of tossing and displacement. Each of the signs, therefore, carries within itself 1/8 of certainty. The succession of the first 4 constitutes a half-certainty, which forms the doubt itself, and may be regarded as a kind of balance. Beyond that, probability begins. This arithmetic of implication is valid for both curative indications and for diagnostic signs. A patient who had consulted Brulé wanted to be operated upon for a stone. There were two favorable probabilities in favor of intervention: the good condition of the bladder and the small size of the stone. But there were four unfavorable probabilities against them. The patient in his 60s, he is of the male sex, he is of a bilious temperament, he has a skin disease. The subject would not hear of this simple arithmetic and did not survive the operation. It was hoped by an arithmetic of cases to balance the relation of logical structure, but between the phenomenon and what it signified, there was not the same link as between the event and the series to which it belonged. This confusion occurred only because of the ambiguous virtues of analysis, to which doctors were always having recourse. Without the emblematic thread of analysis, we could not often find our way through the labyrinthian ways to the sanctuary of truth. But analysis was defined according to the epistemological model of mathematics and the instrumental structure of ideology. As an instrument, it served to define the system of implications in its complex totality. By this method, one dissects a subject, a complete idea. One examines the parts separately, one after another, the most essential ones first, then those that are less so, with their various relations. One rises to the most simple idea, but like its mathematical model, this analysis was used to determine an unknown idea. One examines the mode of composition, the way in which it has been operated, and hence, by the use of induction, one arrives at the unknown from the known. Sells said of the clinic that it was scarcely more than the very practice of medicine at the patient's bedside. And that, as such, it was identical with practical medicine in the strict sense. The clinic was much more than a revival of the old medical empiricism. It was concrete life, the first application of analysis. Moreover, despite its opposition to systems and theories, it recognizes its immediate kinship with philosophy. Why separate the science of the doctors from that of the philosophers? Why distinguish between two studies that share a common origin and end? The clinic is a field made philosophically visible by the introduction into the pathological domain of grammatical and probabilistic structures. These structures may be dated historically because they are contemporary with Condillac and his successors. They freed medical perception from the play of essence and symptom, and from the no less ambiguous play of species and individuals. The figure disappeared by which visible and invisible were pivoted in accordance with the principle that the patient both conceals and reveals the specificity of his disease. A domain of clear visibility was opened up to the gaze. But are not this domain itself and that which fundamentally makes it visible doubly in accord? Are they not based on overlapping forms that nevertheless evade one another? The grammatical model, acclimatized in the analysis of signs, remains implicit and enveloped without formalization in the depths of the conceptual movement. It is a question of a transference of the forms of intelligibility. The mathematical model is always explicit and invoked. It is present as the principle of coherence of a conceptual process that culminates outside itself. It is a question of the contribution of themes of formalization. But this fundamental contradiction was not felt to be such, and the gaze that rested on this apparently liberated domain seemed, for a time, a happy gaze. See, end of chapter 6 of The Birth of the Clinic by Michel Foucault.